Welcome to the Supply Chain Beyond the Hype podcast with me, Chris Clowes, and a variety of guests from across the supply chain world, ready to share their insights, stories, and experience to help you go beyond the hype. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Supply Chain Beyond the Hype podcast. As we go into December, it would have been easy to focus on the golden period and Black Friday and Cyber Monday. But instead, we're going to address a much more interesting topic and look forward to the impact of the UK's budget on the supply chain and the logistics industry and what the impact might be in 2026. I'm delighted to welcome, for a second time, my second guest actually, Jamie Hartles, Group CEO at Howard Tenens, and Phil Roe, the President of Logistics UK, the trade association. Before we jump into the topics themselves, maybe Jamie and Phil, you can just give a brief introduction to yourselves and what you do with your businesses. Jamie, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. An honour to be the first repeat guest on your prestigious podcast, Chris. So I am a Group CEO at Howard Tenens. We're a mid-sized, privately owned logistics business providing third-party services to an array of clients from across the entire business sector in the UK. We also own 4.5 million square feet of commercial freehold property as well across the UK from a warehousing perspective, as well as some residential units and other bits and pieces. Turnover about £120 million a year and employ about 850 people.
Cheers. Thanks, Jamie. Phil?
Hi, thank you very much for my first invitation.
First of many, I hope.
Well, maybe we'll see how I get on. Great to be here. Yeah, so I'm Phil Roe. I worked in the logistics and transport industry all my life. Most recently, as the non-exec chair or president, as they call it, at Logistics UK. Been here for three and a half years, and it's before that I worked in the 3PL industry. So I worked for DHL and XL as was, and a few others besides. Logistics UK, really interesting organisation, a trade association, Chris, as you said in your introduction, but also a business in its own right. It's a not-for-profit business, but it supplies a whole range of services to the UK logistics industry. And in terms of representation, we've got a very broad membership base. Unusually, we represent buyers of logistics as well as operators of logistics, as well as providers of infrastructure and public sector organisations as well. So we have a very broad view of the industry, representing all modes and across the whole of the UK.
Super. Well, thank you both for those introductions. There was obviously an awful lot of anticipation before the budget announcement yesterday, and even if we did get it 20 minutes early, and a huge array of topics covered. But today we're going to deep dive into 5 of those that affect the logistics industry. So the minimum wage changes and labour costs, the approach to capital investment and the potential impact on automation, looking at the changes to business rates and our warehouses now paying for the high street, the end of the de minimis charges that are obviously phased over a long period of time, and then a quick look at the transition to electric and the impact of the changes there. So we'll dive right in with the first one, and a quick summary of those minimum wage rises and living wage rise changes. So national living wage is rising to £12.71, about a 7% increase. That's likely, I think, going to drive much tougher wage negotiations across the whole business. So supervisors, team leaders, managers are probably now expecting bigger increases. And what does this mean for more bespoke work, or where there's already a premium, such as night shift working, forklift truck drivers, frozen warehouse operators? So is this labour cost pricing shock going to drive an improvement in productivity or just exacerbate a labour shortage? So Jamie, as someone that employs 850 people, and I appreciate we're barely 24 hours after the budget. Kind of, what's your business's current feeling on the impact?
So look, the rise to £12.71, and particularly it's not something that's happened in isolation. That increase in national minimum wage has been increasing for several years now in quite large percentage terms. And effectively what those increases do is it just further shifts manual roles from what used to be very much a low-cost, flexible resource in labour to what is a structurally higher cost input. And from a logistics perspective, as you've noted, it isn't just the base rate that's increased, it's that compression effect that it has on all staff, everyone from not just people who are on minimum wage, but team leaders, MHE drivers, management planners. Everybody feels that compression effect, and therefore, for a labour-intensive site, it can be an incredibly significant uplift to the total labour bill across that site. And the economics are relatively simple. If you think back to even as relatively recently as April 24, when the rate was at £11.44, it's now going to be at £12.71 at April 26. And therefore, unless productivity increases in parallel or charges increase, then operators are going to see a bottom line impact. It's about that simple. And therefore, you're faced with that choice of you've got roles that can deliver clear throughput, accuracy, service value. They stay viable. But when you're looking at low productivity tasks, they become candidates for automation.
And Phil, you mentioned how Logistics UK represents across the whole industry and multimodal. How do you see this impacting different segments, whether it's transport, haulage, shipping, ports, railways?
I think it's probably more likely to have impact in warehousing than anywhere else, really, because it's where you've got a multiplicity of those more manual roles that Jamie described a moment ago. I think the compression effect will be felt in a lot of different places, but I think the warehouses are where it will get felt the most. And of course, everybody will be suffering from it. So where you've got organisations that buy logistics from other organisations, they too will be facing into cost increasing for this category of worker. So I think it will make people cautious about more employment. And I think, it's interesting that unemployment is slightly on the rise again, isn't it? Last set of stats was up at 5%. And I know as I go around and talk to different people, partly I think because of all the other things that might have happened in the budget and then largely didn't. There's a sense of nervousness about hiring people, and that's not brilliant. But I suspect it's going to stay there I suspect that's going to stay there for some time.
And do you think that's linked to the changes to workers' rights from day one as well?
Not yet, but I think it's a culmination of two or three things, really. There have been substantial rises, as Jamie just talked about, all the way through. The national insurance rise, which remember was as big as the whole of the tax burden rise this time last year. The uncertainty about where we're going to end up on after the consultation on that bill as well. And probably the overarching issue is that it's a bit of a nervous economy. There's not a lot of this. Some companies are seeing some growth and there's some good news stories out there, but not massively. I think the consensus, I would say, is that the economy is pretty flat.
And do you think, maybe a question for both of you, the logistics industry is notorious for pricing being very much supply and demand driven, huge movement from peaks to the bottom, and hauliers and logistics companies chasing revenue over profit. Do you think that this is actually a correction in wages, and that the industry has relied on cheaper labour for too long, and actually it's a positive thing for the industry?
I think what I'd say to that is that these changes are not just about the logistics industry. Yeah, in fact, it's much broader than that. We employ 8% of the UK's workforce across the sector. So this is about changing. It's a political thing, isn't it? It's about changing the reward for work. So I don't think we should view what's going on here as the causation coming from our sector. Really, this is a general reflection on the economy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the industry, to its credit, has been prepared. We're an industry that's been struggled with labour supply for some time. So it's not necessarily just about the cost of the labour, it's also about the availability of it. And therefore, the industry over the last 20 years has made huge steps forward in automation and looking for efficiency and productivity to protect against exactly these type of circumstance brought on by supply and cost inputs.
Yeah, and that brings us on quite nicely to the second point around automation and capital investment, and these two are obviously very clearly linked with the increase in minimum wage and national living wage, and the changes to fully expensing of capital investment. So there's now 100% tax relief on things like robotics, conveyors, AMRs, EV chargers. Automation becomes 10, 20, 30% cheaper. ROI windows can drop by 18 to 24 months. Is the government almost actively trying to move to higher skilled, more automated work?
Well, I think, first of all, we're really pleased to see the expensing go through. It's something that we've been pushing for 2 or 3 years, because there is, in the UK economy, a productivity problem. Yeah, and one of the best ways of working out productivity is to actually achieve more with less. And I think anything that helps do that, particularly in areas of modern technology, I think is to be welcomed. I think probably as important, maybe even more important than the relative position with wages, is the fact that the availability of automation has completely changed over the last 10 years. If you go back, I remember I ran an automated warehouse 25 years ago. Yeah, they were huge things. They had a payback of about 300 years if you were lucky. Yeah, and now you can automate individual processes within warehouses. You can take some of the things that people don't like doing really, and automate those as well. So I actually think this is a good thing. I think the more we balance up the roles in logistics, the better. There's things that people don't want to do anymore.
Again, totally agree. I welcome very much the full expensing permanency piece. It just, more than anything, clearly there's a big tax benefit there, but more than anything, it just brings certainty to those sort of multi-year investments. It just gives, in a time as we open with, of great uncertainty, it is a nice sort of bright spot to bring some certainty to investing in the UK. Whether or not that's a deliberate strategy from the government to encourage investment and productivity, who knows? But certainly it's a positive outcome from that decision. And look, to Phil's point, the availability of different types of robotics and automation and the applicability of those technologies is vast now comparatively. So you've got cobots in the form of AMRs can be applied to relatively old buildings, and you've got, as Phil articulated, processes within what were relatively antiquated solutions which can be automated while the rest remain more contemporary. So the options are not insignificant now, and therefore that enticement to invest, both in terms of a push from an increase in the labour cost, and the pull in terms of the effective reduction in the cost in automation through the full expensing certainly helps.
And do you see this kind of multi-tipping point? Do you see this as an opportunity to bring forward investment plans in your sites?
So yes, for us, absolutely, and it's one of the joys of a more challenging market is it gives us the opportunity to demonstrate our capability as an organisation, and where we can really add value as a third-party logistics partner. And that's about challenging the status quo and doing things in a way which is more efficient. And therefore, being able to put a business case together for a client that says, actually, if we we'll invest in the automation on your behalf for the right level of contract term. And now, given that certainty, making those investments certainly pulls the ROI period to a lower position. And as you mentioned, Chris, you're looking at ROIs of, I think when we implemented cobots on one of our clients, we were looking at an 18-month ROI. So it's compelling on that basis. And we're a business that likes to make long-term investments as well. But when you've got shorter-term investment opportunities on that basis, it just becomes a no-brainer.
Mm.
And Phil, you mentioned 20 years ago when the ROI was 300 years. So I think we're something with a small pinch of salt that we've had automation for a long time, and there are still, I'd say, the vast majority of warehouses still lack any level of automation. Do you think that we're going to see an acceleration of adoption?
I do, yeah, but I don't think it'll be an acceleration of adoption of fully automated warehousing, because you've got to really understand the task over the payback period in order to invest there. And now there are some companies that have done that. There's some fantastic sites that have been around recently with some of our members up at East Midlands Gateway, for example. But for a lot of businesses, particularly a lot of shared use businesses, you can't afford to take the risk. And so where I think we'll see the big increase is in flexible technologies that apply almost irrespective of who the customer is. The other day I was looking at some drones that do inventory management, which means that you don't have to put people on trucks in cages and all the rest of it to do that. Automatic cleaning, automatic wrapping, the development of the bot, as it were, and then the use of that in lots of different use cases, I think is what will drive that. And the really good thing is they're not that expensive. So businesses of all sizes can afford to try this. And there's been a bit of an increase as well, I think, in the market in terms of supply. So there's lots of people out there who are really interested in selling it to you.
Awesome. I really appreciate that start, kind of looking at minimum wage impact and then this change to fully expensing and how those two work together hand in hand. We'll move on to the next one, which is maybe a little bit more of a negative for the industry as we look at the changes to business rates for warehouses. So retail, hospitality, leisure have all got decreases in their rateable values, and larger warehouses are facing a higher multiple. So it looks like warehouses are paying for the high street, which is a massive simplification, but I think was actually, I think the view is potentially that we've got large e-com providers that are not paying for, and maybe one in particular, that are not paying the same level as tax as, say, a high street retailer. So Jamie, you mentioned that you own 4.5 million square foot of warehousing. So that's a sizable warehouses that maybe fall into this category. So what does this mean for your immediate plans for expansion? And would you be looking to dispose of any assets, or does it actually give you some opportunities?
So we certainly wouldn't be looking to dispose of any assets. For us, when there's an overcapacity in the marketplace, which there is today, there's a lot of grey space around, so space which is unutilized but let. It's an opportunity during that time of consolidation to buy well and buy more assets from a commercial property perspective. So that side of the business benefits extremely well in these sort of times. Clearly, from a tenancy perspective, it's relatively simple in that we pass or the tenants pay for their rates directly. And we are able to be more competitive on the rates because we own the product, and therefore we can manage that accordingly. On the logistics side of the business, clearly it's more challenging. Certainly in that sort of mega shed environment, empty space becomes very, very expensive. Not only have you got rents going out the door if you don't own the sites, but now you've got rates which are a significant proportion of the square footage cost, and any empty space clearly compounds that significantly. For us as a business, although it is very much a blunt tool from a tax perspective, because perversely, quite a few small retailers hold their stock in very large sheds on a shared user basis, and therefore you're hitting all of them as well as the larger providers. Because it's unilateral and well documented, it's relatively simple to deal with in terms of having to approach customers and pass those costs through. It's not something that we enjoy having to do, and clearly where we can find continuous improvement opportunities to negate the cost increases, we put them in place. However, the industry has suffered significant impacts financially over the last few years. We've already talked about the NIC piece, talked about labour going up as a cost base. Productivity isn't outstripping those cost increases, and therefore, despite all the continuous improvement work we've done, there is only so much honing you can do over years before there's very little left to do. So naturally, we have to pass those costs through to customers where we can.
Do you see a potential shift from larger to medium or smaller size sheds that would offset the increases? So I think generally a larger warehouse should be able to drive more efficiency, but would two smaller warehouses offset that decreased efficiency because of their lower rateable value, do you think?
I guess my challenge is that, like so many policies, the cut-off point is very low. £500,000 from a rateable value perspective, it doesn't take much to get above that threshold. And therefore, I think it's unlikely that we're going to see a switch away from larger sheds above a RV of £500,000 to ones at below £500,000. It's just that it doesn't take much to get from the square footage perspective to get to £500,000.
Yeah. And Phil, from a trade association perspective, kind of are you disappointed with this from a government policy, or?
Yeah, I mean, we lobbied against it because we think it's a bit too blunt an instrument. We can kind of understand what they were trying to achieve, but virtually everything on the high street is supplied from a warehouse. So what you give with one hand, you take away with another. And my own feeling also is that if you want to revitalise the high street, then okay, this might help a little bit, but it's not really the answer. This is about customer behaviour and experience. And why else do all those big warehouses, a lot of them that have existed for a long time, many of them have e-commerce operations within them because that's where the customers want to buy. So if you've got a lot of empty space on a high street, then you might have at the margins a small improvement as a result of this, but it's not going to increase your footfall. So I think, I think it's a blunt instrument, really.
Yeah.
And I think the other problem that I think we've tried to explain as well is that if you get a cost increase like this, it's a bit like the cost increase on the minimum wage. What tends to happen in those discussions between buyers and sellers is there might be an acceptance that you can't avoid it, but then the challenge will be find me other ways of saving that money. And so the cost pressure that is put on the industry gets higher and higher and higher. And when you're in that kind of a debate, I've been there for over the years many, many times, then you tend to hunker down a bit, really.
Yeah.
So think it's a bit blunt. I agree with Jamie. I don't think it'll do anything. It may actually increase the rents on small buildings that are under the threshold anyway.
Man goes up.
Yeah, or actually, just people think the relative pricing, so it should be priced differently. So no, I don't think it's a brilliant bit of news for the sector. And I've talked to a couple of organisations who've got a lot of shops and a lot of warehouses, and they're trying to figure out whether they benefit or not. I think.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You can see. I imagine the finance teams of various organisations are working hard at the moment. But do you think the government could actually be looking at this the wrong way round? We've touched upon a bit about consumer confidence, footfall, and spending driving the economy, but equally, I think there's a lot in the budget about investment in infrastructure. So Sizewell C is obviously being built at the moment, new reactors on Anglesey, Thames Crossing looks as though it's finally been approved, a lower crossing, hopefully a third runway and an adaptation of Gatwick runway as well, or a third runway at Heathrow. They all require warehouses to support them, let alone the 1.5 million homes that are going to be built. So are we actually jeopardising our ability to drive this growth because we're increasing the cost of building?
I don't think so, to be honest, because the infrastructure expenditure is so desperately needed in this country. I mean, if you look at the work we did looking at the competitiveness of the UK's logistics infrastructure, some 10 years ago we were 4th in the world, and now we're 19th. And we identified a whole series of areas that need investing in, that could bring up to 8 billion benefit a year to the UK. And one of the biggest areas was infrastructure. The bigger issue on supporting infrastructure is actually identifying the skills area and the workforce area, because all infrastructure, and particularly house building, if you sort of loosely put that in the same category, are tremendously logistics intensive. And it's really interesting actually to see, for example, what they've had to do at Sizewell in terms of training programs and recruitment, because they need people near there, same Hinkley Point as well. So no, I don't think these things that we've talked about so far impact on that. I think it's more about the general economy. And, remember, you look at our makeup of GDP, we're much more reliant on consumer expenditure than we are on anything else. And if you start to increase these costs, as Jamie said, they're very inelastic. For organisations, fuel duty even more so, and so it will push inflation up because they will get passed through the supply chain.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we've covered so far kind of the minimum wage and automation opportunity, and then the business rates and the impact on warehouses. We'll now kind of go outside of the UK and maybe look at a change that could be positive for UK warehousing. The end in a couple of years' time, at least, or 4 years' time, of the de minimis rules. So at the moment, the £135 threshold has enabled the growth of the likes of Temu and Shein and direct from China supply models. So this potentially incentivizes local UK stock holdings, use of obviously warehousing, and brings potentially Temu and Shein in line in terms of a competitive nature, at least in pricing, with UK-based retailers. Jamie, as a warehouse operator, do you see opportunities there to target customers and offer services to these businesses now?
It definitely brings opportunity. I mean, based on all the conversations we've just had in terms of effectively increasing the UK price of warehouse management, some of that competitive advantage gained by the removal of the de minimis charge is eroded by us pushing our own cost base up significantly. But yes, I mean, that it certainly feels like, and time will tell, but certainly it helps move some of the edge of that direct from China micro parcel model. And yeah, potentially in terms of that bulk importation into the UK, domestic fulfillment becomes more financially and certainly operationally smoother as a result. Whether it sort of tips the scales and everything changes, I would be surprised. But certainly, time to tell.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, if you think about those kind of purchases, yeah, what really matters is speed. So it's unlikely, I think, that e-commerce providers will want to introduce extra steps that slow down deliveries of things that people are often waiting for anyway when they're being shipped as micro orders. And it'd be interesting to see actually how much the impact is on a typical purchase, but I suspect it's not going to make a lot of difference. I think the cost will just be added onto the consumer.
And do you think that this is a genuine attempt at levelling up the playing field for UK retailers, or do you think it's a protectionist move to keep Chinese retailers out of the UK? And especially when we think about policy or UK policy outside of domestically, there's obviously a lot of talk about how our relationship with China at the moment, the new embassy in London. Do you think this is a part of an overall China policy, or do you think it's a positive headline that looks good for UK retailers?
Well, I think if you take the two scenarios that you described a minute ago, saying what is this for? Is it a China policy on one hand, or is it a levelling up? It's not going to be much of a China policy, just this measure, is it really? It's pretty small beer, really. It's not going to stop those organisations wanting to sell their particular brand of e-commerce internationally. So I suspect I think it's probably more about an opportunity for getting parity of tax revenue.
Yeah, totally agree.
You two are far too in agreement. I'm trying to create a debate here. You guys got to help me out. And it's sort of linked to our next topic. So as we look at electrification or decarbonisation of fleet and the potential new 3p per mile duty for electric vehicles, that could also play into a China policy. If we look at the growth of BYD and Chinese car makers and imports into the UK, there's a potential that we start slowing down the adoption of electric vehicles. So I guess not really a question, more of something to ponder. So that I think, Phil, from a policy perspective, and again, talking to your members, does this fundamentally change the total cost of ownership calculation for EV vehicles, or do you think it's a sensible approach?
I think it's a signpost, actually, more than anything else, because as I understand it, it doesn't apply to vans and lorries. So this is, I think, a signpost which says we've got to recover the taxation that we're losing through diesel-powered vehicles somehow. And to be honest, that was always going to have to happen at some point. I think the interesting thing when you look at it, though, is to say by putting a scheme like this in place so that you start it up and it's not imminent, it does give you, though, the ability to spread it across different vehicle categories. And it could be seen as, and I'm not, they're not saying this to us or anything like that, but you could see it as a way of going towards a usage-based pricing. So I think this is more about EV versus diesel. It's more about filling an obvious gap. I actually think they're better off signposting this now rather than waiting until it becomes a huge problem. And in terms of adoption of EVs, yes, it will slow it down a bit. But the reality, I think, from everything I've heard, particularly this is just on cars, is that the real issue on cars is the price of the car. And there's a strong feeling I've picked up that the people that can afford to pay a lot of money for a car, an electric one, if they're convinced that's the right thing to do, a lot of them have already done that. And so the real thing that's needed to drive adoption of cars is much lower cost cars, and that's where I think your reference to China comes in.
And Jamie, I think I've obviously worked with you before and seen your vehicles and the number of trials you've done with biofuels. What does this mean, if anything, for what you're doing at Howard Tenens at looking at decarbonising your HGVs and heavy good fleet?
So to Phil's point, it definitely feels like the thin end of a wedge, but one that's necessary to keep the tax coffers topped up as diesel and fossil fuels become less used in combustion vehicles. For us, we remain open to options. So we've experimented with lots of different fuel types. So hydrotreated vegetable oil is our weapon choice at the moment. And particularly in the very heavy goods space, so particularly 44-ton vehicles, there is no viable electric solution at the moment that delivers, let alone something. And even as you move down the scale to sort of 42 tonners, they suffer from heavy batteries and therefore payload degradation, long charge times, incredibly expensive purchase prices. So they're just, on their own, they're not commercially viable at the moment, although evidence suggests that costs will come down, charging time will come down, weight will come down, and therefore over time you will find that commercial viability tips over into a positive position versus diesel in the longer term. So for us, it's just about staying really close to technologies and for what we're trying to do is reduce the amount of carbon that we put into the atmosphere, and we can do that today by burning hydrotreated vegetable oil to up to 90% versus diesel. We ran 50% of our fleet last year on HVO. If you think about that in real terms, that's enormous. We buy something like 5 million litres of fuel per annum, and half of that was HVO, and that will be carbon that we'll never. We've burnt that fuel now, it will never be in the atmosphere again. So we've made a difference. And then it's about working with the likes of Project Jolt and other providers to ensure the technology continues to be driven forward. Our big challenge in the UK, really, in relation to this, is infrastructure. I just see the refueling and recharging of vehicles and the electricity required to achieve a transition to EVs across the sector is enormous. The grid is struggling as of today. Our experience in putting solar across our rooftop estate and being able to put that power back into the grid has been challenging in some areas. And therefore, the amount of investment that's required in that space to unlock the capability is significant. I'm actually quite confident that the vehicle manufacturers will get there in terms of technology which is commercially viable. The main concern is around having the infrastructure to recharge that equipment to allow it to run.
I mean, it's strange you asked that question, Chris, and I'm sat here after our decarbonisation conference today, fourth annual decarb conference. We had a great lineup of speakers talking about decarbonisation across the whole of the supply chain, across all modes. 120 or so people from the industry all over. The really big issue with this is that, well, there's two for me. I think the first is I feel that we talk too much about electrification and not enough about carbon emission reduction. There's a massive role to be played by the HVOs and the low carbon fuels. Why wouldn't we want to be 80% better now rather than wait and make no difference and be 100% better at some unspecified point in the future? So we produced a report last week actually on low carbon fuels, where we're really pushing the government to acknowledge that actually promoting and getting behind low carbon fuels would be a way of reducing carbon emissions earlier than is currently expected inside those plans. And I think there's definitely something that should be done there. And then the second point is, if it's all about electrification, it's all about power. We did a piece of work for the government. We said we need, I think it was 32 terawatt hours of electricity per annum just to electrify the UK transport industry, which is something like 85% of a nuclear power station. Yeah. Now, that's an astonishing amount of power. And it also, that our work also says that most people expect that power will need to be delivered 90% at base, 10% on the road, maybe 80%, something along those lines. Now, that means that not only have we got to find that power, but we've then got to put it in 30,000 warehouses or yards. And the enormity of that task is, I think, only really now being understood. NISO, who part of the setup for the future strategy of the energy industry, starting to look at this. But when people are asked, "Are you confident we're going to hit 2050?" I think in a room of 120 people, there might have been 5.
I'm surprised it's that many. And I think you see so much emotion around the discussion, particularly between electric and hydrogen, around which is right. And I think that's a really good point, that this has got to be surely a transition, and that whilst Tesla, I think in particular, has delivered a step change in the approach to electrification of cars, we don't have the equivalent of Tesla doing something for trucks. There's no brand new OEM that's come to the market.
But also, there aren't any cars that utilize like trucks, though.
Yes.
Maybe taxis a bit, maybe, but not even then, to be honest.
Yeah, I think cars are 95% of their time are parked.
Yeah, so it's a totally different use case. Which is why I think we've got to be better every step of the way, not wait for a miracle cure.
Yeah, that's a really good... you've almost taken away the final thoughts. So it's really... I appreciate you taking the time quite soon after the budget to share some of your thoughts. But I think in summary, labour has just got more expensive. Capital has potentially got significantly cheaper. And we've got challenges around, I guess, rates and the cost of warehousing, but also potential challenges to the cost of transport and certainly different makeup of those costs. So as we look ahead to 2026, maybe a final thought from each of you as to what you'd love to see happen as maybe the spring statement, or as we go into this time next year. Maybe the autumn budget won't be quite so late. But maybe a little bit, maybe Phil, we chatted earlier, what didn't we see in the budget and what would you like to have seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth reflecting that the backdrop to this budget was driven by a reduction in the growth forecast for the UK economy and a reduction in the productivity improvement forecast for the UK economy. Bang, big hole. Yeah. What we didn't really see much of, there were some things in there, but we didn't see as much as I think we need to, is the delivery of those strategies that the government have created to grow the economy. And the industrial strategy, for example, barely got a mention. Yeah, the infrastructure strategy, they put some money in for 350 more people to help do paperwork on planning. Yeah, but we are still the most expensive place in the world to put energy infrastructure down.
If I could just add to that, so Vienna Airport has just cancelled the project to build a third runway. Guess how much the budget was?
I've no idea.
Heathrow's third runway is between 25 and 50 billion pounds. Vienna's budget was 2 billion euros. What is going on?
But it'll take 10 years to go through planning. Yeah, I mean, you talk to the big developers, and Jamie, you know this better than I do, but it's a nonsense. The logistics infrastructure of this country, its warehouses, its roads, its ports, its airports, its rail system, are nationally significant assets. They go to determine, in part anyway, how productive and how competitive we are. They should be treated like that and managed like that, rather than go through layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy to achieve the growth that we need in the UK. So there's bits of this that have already come out at various times. So I'm not in a mad rant here, but I think unless we grow this economy, we're going to have the likelihood of these kind of budgets that are trying to get bits of money from all over the place. It's going to continue, isn't it? What we need is a period of growth.
And Jamie, maybe some final thoughts from you?
I mean, so it would be remiss of me, given this opportunity, not to mention the driver crisis. And I know that's minutiae compared to the very large topics you guys have just been talking about in relation to the budget. But at the moment, it's only because volumes are depressed that we're not seeing a UK driver crisis again. We saw a small flare-up through the summer this year, and it's just to remind everyone that is a problem that has not gone away. I would love to see more in terms of investment in training and being able to recreate that market as one that is one to aspire to be in, rather than one that's almost stigmatized. And when the volumes do come back, and at some point if we hit those growth aspirations that Phil's talked through there, they will, when the market recovers, we will be faced with yet another driver crisis. And the only answer to that is going to be paying more money, I'm afraid, because we have a systemic issue there.
It was interesting yesterday, the bit about fully expensing apprenticeships in small and medium-sized businesses, because the vast majority of logistics businesses are small and medium-sized.
Yes.
We haven't really got the sort of detail to be able to know if that is as good news as it might be. Yeah. But I think continuing down that angle and being able to use levy for driver training is something we're very strongly pushing for. Yeah,
and I wholeheartedly endorse that. The more that we can do to create a better, younger driver pool, the faster, the sooner, the better.
And I think that's I think we need that investment in apprenticeships and the like to get younger drivers. But I also think something like 90% of truck operators in the UK have fewer than 10 trucks. They're really small companies. They're family owned. They're third generation. It's also making sure that they've got the support to access that funding, because it's not simple.
No, well, they have moved it, haven't they, to make it more local. But you're right; it's not simple at all. And particularly, I think, for the people that are operating in, what used to be called old-fashioned words, the hire and reward market. That's where we need to see the support really the most, because they're the areas that flex most when things pick up.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much. I really appreciate you pulling your thoughts together within the last kind of 24, 36 hours. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, then please do subscribe. And hopefully we get to see Phil and Jamie next year as well. So thank you both very much for your time.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Phil.
All the best.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Beyond the Hype. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when new episodes are released.